Before getting into today's stories, let me know where everyone is from and what time so we can send wishes of health and luck to you and your relatives and friends. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos of our channel. Thank you very much, everyone. Let's get started. Story 1. Pedro, my ex-father-in-law, spent his life working on ranches. He told me this story once, late at night over a bottle of tequila, swearing every word was true. It happened in the early 1980s somewhere down in Frio County along Highway 57, near Eagle Pass. Pedro had taken a job as a ranch hand for a man named Ferguson, who owned a sprawling property that stretched for miles. Ferguson had built himself a home on one end of the property, but Pedro lived in a mobile home on the other side, not far from an abandoned construction site. The structure was meant to be a ranch hand's house, but it had never been finished. 3 walls of cinder blocks stood like a crumbling shell, topped by a partial roof that seemed to sag under the weight of years. Pedro said it always felt off, even during the day. One late afternoon, as Pedro was working on a fence, he spotted a group of migrants cautiously crossing the property. They froze when they saw him, their nervous eyes darting around for an escape. "Hey!" Pedro shouted, waving a hand to get their attention. "What are you doing out here?" The leader of the group, a man in his 30s with a weary face, stepped forward, his hands raised in surrender. "Señor, we mean no harm. We are just passing through looking for a place to rest." Pedro glanced toward the unfinished house. "You see that structure over there," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You can stay there for the night, but you need to leave early. If Ferguson finds you, I'll have to say I didn't see you." The man hesitated, glancing at the others in his group before nodding. "Gracias, señor. We'll be gone before sunrise." Pedro watched as they made their way to the abandoned house, their figures silhouetted against the orange glow of the setting sun. Something about the scene unsettled him, but he shrugged it off and headed back to his mobile home. That night, Pedro lay awake, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. Around 3 a.m., he decided to check on the group. He grabbed a flashlight and made his way toward the house, the crunch of gravel under his boots the only sound in the still night. When he reached the house, he stopped in his tracks. The group wasn't there. Confused, Pedro scanned the area with his flashlight until the beam landed on a cluster of shapes about 50 feet from his mobile home. The migrants had moved their camp to the open ground, huddled together like frightened animals. "Hey," Pedro called, walking toward them. "Why did you move? I told you the house was fine." The man from earlier stood, his face pale and his voice trembling. "Lo siento, señor. We cannot stay there." Pedro frowned. "Why not? What's wrong with the house?" The man's eyes darted toward the unfinished structure. "We heard voices," he said, his voice barely audible. "Crying, screaming. It is not a place for the living." Pedro felt a chill creep up his spine. "What do you mean? Voices? There's no one here but us." Another man in the group spoke up, his voice urgent. "They were screaming for help, calling out to us. It was as if they were trapped inside the walls." A woman in the group clutched her child, whispering a prayer. "No one should stay in that place," she said. "It is cursed." Pedro didn't know what to say. The group packed up their belongings and left before dawn, their frightened whispers lingering in the air long after they were gone. Years passed, and Pedro never mentioned the incident. Life moved on, and he and Ferguson grew closer, sharing beers on the porch on quiet nights. One evening, after a few too many drinks, Pedro decided to bring it up. "Ferguson," he said, his voice low, "there's something I've been meaning to tell you. Years ago, some illegals passed through the ranch. I told them they could stay the night in that old house, but they didn't. They said they heard voices, screaming." Ferguson didn't respond right away. He stared into the distance, the glow of his cigarette illuminating his weathered face. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but heavy. "Pedro," he said, "there's something I've never told you. I probably should have, but I didn't want to scare you." Pedro leaned forward, his unease growing. "What do you mean?" Ferguson sighed, taking a long drag from his cigarette. "When I was a kid, my grandfather ran this ranch. He was a hard man, the kind who didn't believe in second chances. A few times I saw him catch illegals crossing the land. He didn't turn them in." Pedro frowned. "Then what did he do?" Ferguson's eyes met Pedro's, and for the first time, Pedro saw fear in them. "He killed them, buried them right where that house stands." Pedro's heart sank. "You're telling me that house is built on graves?" Ferguson nodded slowly. He figured no one would ever find out. But when they started building the house, the contractors wouldn't finish it. They said they heard voices, crying, screaming. Same thing those illegals told you? Pedro sat in the stunned silence, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. The wind whistled through the trees, carrying with it a faint, almost human sound. Ferguson, Pedro said finally, his voice barely a whisper. Do you ever hear it? Ferguson didn't answer. He just stared into the darkness, his grip tightening on the bottle of beer in his hand. That night, Pedro swore he heard faint cries coming from the direction of the unfinished house. When he mentioned it to Ferguson the next morning, Ferguson shook his head and muttered, best not to think about it. But Pedro couldn't help it. Decades later, he still woke up some nights to the sound of screaming echoing in his mind, wondering if it was real or if the house was calling to him. Story 2. I was 8 when I first saw what I now call the Watchers. Growing up in a tiny Midwestern village in Ohio, my world revolved around the woods behind my house. The town had fewer than 50 residents, and with no internet or cable TV, my days were spent exploring the dense forest, wading through the creek, and searching for signs of animals. My father had grown up in the same house, and he often shared stories about the woods. Before I set off on my adventures, he would always say, the trees may not walk or talk, but they see, and they remember. I thought he was just being poetic, a way to warn me to be careful. One humid July afternoon, I went deeper into the woods than usual, following the creek as it wound through the dense undergrowth. The air was heavy, and the only sound was the gentle trickle of water. After hiking for what felt like miles, I reached a familiar clearing filled with tall grass and blackberry bushes. It was a spot I visited often to snack on the berries and watch for deer. As I stepped into the clearing, I froze. Someone was standing in the middle of the field, completely still. My heart pounded as I crouched low in the grass, trying to stay hidden. The figure wore dark clothing, and their face was turned away from me. No one came this far into the woods. The nearest house was a mile away, through dense forest and steep ravines. I stayed there for what felt like hours watching the figure. Then, as if sensing my gaze, they turned slightly. I ducked lower, heart racing. But when I looked again, the clearing was empty. The figure had vanished. I didn't wait to investigate. Turning back toward home, I kept to the edge of the creek, moving as quietly as possible. Every step felt heavier, as though the woods were pressing in around me, watching. About halfway back, I stopped in my tracks. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again, a figure standing just beyond the trees, motionless. When I turned to look, it melted into the shadows. I kept walking, my breath shallow and quick. A few minutes later, I saw another figure, further away but still there, lingering. This time I stopped and spoke aloud. My voice was shaky, but I tried to sound firm. I don't know who you are, but I'm just passing through. I don't want any trouble. The woods didn't respond, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my ears. Finally, I broke through the tree line into my backyard. My father was by the shed, burning grass clippings in a metal barrel. He looked up as I approached, his expression unreadable. You saw them, he said, his voice calm but heavy. I nodded, unable to speak. He set down his tools and walked toward the edge of the woods. Pulling a can of tobacco from his pocket, he opened it, took a pinch, and placed it carefully on a flat stone just inside the tree line. I followed him, my voice trembling. What are you doing? An offering, he said simply. For the Watchers. The Watchers, I repeated, unsure if I wanted to hear more. He turned to face me, his expression serious. Spirits, guardians of this land. They've been here longer than we have. They see everything, and they don't like it when people walk through without showing respect. I stared at the stone, the tobacco glinting in the fading sunlight. What happens if we don't show respect? My father's gaze shifted to the woods, his voice dropping lower. Some people say they get lost, even if they know the woods like the back of their hand. Others say they see things that shouldn't be there, shadows that follow them home. I shivered, remembering the figures I'd seen. Have you ever seen them? He nodded, his expression grim. When I was your age, I wandered too far into the woods. I thought I saw a deer, but it wasn't a deer. It was one of them, watching me from the shadows. I tried to ignore it, but the further I went, the more of them I saw. Always just out of the corner of my eye. I swallowed hard. What did you do? I ran, he said, his voice tight. When I got home, my grandfather told me to make an offering the next time I went into the woods. He said the Watchers don't mean harm, but they don't like to be disrespected. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard. My father clapped a hand on my shoulder. If you see them again, don't run. Speak to them. Apologize for disturbing them, and leave something behind. A token, a sign that you understand this isn't your land. From that day forward, I never entered the woods without an offering. Sometimes it was a handful of berries or a small stone I'd found. Other times it was a whispered apology as I backed away from the edge of the tree line. The watchers never disappeared completely. I would catch glimpses of them in the shadows, feel their eyes on me as I moved through the forest. But they kept their distance, and I learned to respect them. Years later, I mentioned the watchers to my cousins. To my surprise, they nodded knowingly. We've seen them too, one said. We just leave them alone. Even now, when I visit my old home, I make a point to leave something on the stone at the edge of the woods. And every time, as I walk away, I feel their gaze following me, waiting. Story 3. When I was younger, I joined a local youth group that often took us on camping trips to isolated areas. One particular trip still lingers in my mind, more vividly than I'd like. It was meant to be a simple scouting excursion, but what happened in those woods changed how I saw the world forever. It started with a request from our group leader, Mr. Ellis. He asked me, Sarah and Tom, to head into the woods to find some long, sturdy sticks we could carve into tools. The three of us were close, so we didn't think twice about venturing into the forest. It wasn't far from camp, and we'd spent the past few days exploring the area. Don't wander too far, Mr. Ellis had said, his voice firm but kind, and stick together. We laughed it off. We were old enough to take care of ourselves, or so we thought. The woods were dense, the sunlight barely filtering through the canopy of leaves above. We walked in a straight line, keeping track of our surroundings to avoid getting lost. The air felt thick, almost heavy, but we chalked it up to the summer heat. Do you think this one's good? Sarah asked, holding up a branch she'd snapped from a tree. Tom shook his head. Too short. We need something longer, straighter. We kept going, our laughter echoing faintly through the trees. About 15 minutes in, we decided to turn back since we hadn't found anything useful. That's when things started to feel wrong. The path we had taken, which had been clear and straightforward, was no longer there. The trees seemed to have shifted, their trunks impossibly close together, blocking what should have been our way back. Wait, Tom said, stopping in his tracks. This isn't right. Sarah frowned. The path was here. I'm sure of it. We all turned in circles, scanning the forest around us. The trees looked identical, as if we were trapped in some endless loop of green and brown. The air grew colder, and the forest, which had been alive with the sounds of birds and insects, was now unnervingly silent. We just need to keep going straight, I said, trying to steady my voice. We'll find our way back. But straight didn't lead us anywhere. Minutes turned into what felt like hours as we walked, our calls for help swallowed by the oppressive stillness of the woods. Then out of nowhere, we stumbled upon something unexpected, a narrow, cracked concrete path running through the forest, splitting it in two. What is this doing here? Tom asked, his voice low. Sarah shook her head, her face pale. There's nothing like this on the map. Across the path stood a small wooden shack, its roof sagging and its windows boarded up. It looked abandoned, but the sight of it sent a chill down my spine. We should keep moving, I said, stepping back. Tom hesitated, staring at the shack. What if there's something useful in there? Like what? Sarah snapped, her voice sharp with fear. Let's just go. We left the shack behind and followed the cracked concrete path until it led us to another unfamiliar stretch of woods. By now the light had changed, dimming as though the sun was setting, even though our watches said it was mid-afternoon. I'm starting to think we're not going to find camp, Sarah whispered. Don't say that, I replied, though I felt the same sinking dread. Just as panic began to set in, we saw someone, a woman in bright pink and purple clothing, walking briskly along another dirt trail that intersected ours. Relief washed over me, and we ran to her, calling out, Can you help us? Sarah said breathlessly. We're trying to find our campsite. The woman stopped, her expression calm, but oddly detached. She pointed in the direction we had come from. It's that way. Just keep walking and don't stop. Are you sure? Tom began, but she interrupted him. You don't want to stay here longer than you have to. She walked away without another word, disappearing into the woods as quickly as she had appeared. We didn't argue, We followed her directions, and after what felt like an eternity, the trees parted to reveal our campsite. When we stumbled back, exhausted and shaken, Mr. Ellis looked up from where he sat by the fire. "That was quick," he said, glancing at his watch. "You were only gone 20 minutes. We stared at him, stunned. "We've been gone for hours," I said, holding up my watch. "Look." Mr. Ellis frowned. "Your watch must be broken. Free time isn't even over yet." None of it made sense. Our watches, Sarah's phone, all showed we had been gone for over 2 hours, but the sun hadn't moved, and no one at camp seemed to notice we'd been gone long. Later that night, as we sat around the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were watching us. I glanced at the tree line and thought I saw a shadow move. Too tall to be a person, too fast to be an animal. The next morning, I asked Mr. Ellis about the shack and the concrete path. His face darkened. "There's nothing like that out there," he said firmly. "You must have been imagining things." But I knew what I'd seen. Sarah and Tom had seen it too. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the silence of those woods, crushing and unnatural, as though time itself had been around us. To this day, I wonder if we really made it back, or if a part of us is still lost in those woods, walking endlessly through a place where time doesn't belong. Story 4. When I was 22, I visited an old friend, David, who lived in a rural town hours away. His family had moved there years ago, leaving behind the busy streets of our childhood. Their new home was surrounded by untamed wilderness. David called it the Grove, a dense patch of trees and brush that stretched endlessly beyond the fence in their backyard. "It's different here," David said the night I arrived. "The Grove, it's not like anywhere else." "What do you mean?" I asked, setting my bag down. David smirked, but there was no humor in it. "You'll see." That first night after dinner, David and his younger sister Clara started telling me strange stories about the Grove. According to them, if you left something near the fence, it would come back to you, no matter how far you threw it. "Last month, I left my favorite scarf out there," Clara said, her voice low. "It was on my pillow the next morning." I laughed nervously. "That's creepy. Who's bringing it back?" Clara shrugged. "No one. That's the point. The Grove doesn't let things go." David leaned back in his chair, watching me. "Why don't you test it out?" Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my hat, walked to the fence, and tossed it over. The trees beyond seemed to swallow it whole. Hours later, as we sat on the porch, David held up the hat with a grin. "Told you." "Okay," I said, trying to sound unimpressed. "You probably grabbed it when I wasn't looking." Clara shook her head. "No one went near the fence." I wasn't convinced, but the unease was there, lingering like a shadow. The next night, I decided to try again. Without telling anyone, I took an old belt buckle from David's collection and threw it deep into the trees. Hours later, it reappeared, this time on the kitchen counter. I stared at it, my stomach twisting. "All right," I said, confronting David. "How did you do it?" He looked genuinely confused. "What are you talking about?" "This," I said, holding up the buckle. "It was in the Grove." Clara's face went pale. "You shouldn't have done that." "Done what?" I asked, the irritation creeping into my voice. "You shouldn't take things from here," she said quietly. "The Grove doesn't like it." David rolled his eyes. "Stop scaring him. It's just a weird coincidence." Clara didn't respond. She got up and left the room, her shoulders tense. Later that night, David suggested we go into the Grove. "It's probably just an animal or something moving your stuff," he said. "Let's see what's really out there." Clara blocked the door. "You shouldn't go in, not at night." "Come on," David said. "You used to go in all the time." "That was before," Clara snapped. "Things have changed." "What things?" I asked, my voice quieter now. She hesitated, then whispered, "Just don't go." But we went anyway, me, David, and his friend Mark. We climbed over the fence, flashlights in hand, and ventured into the Grove. The air was heavier, colder than the rest of the yard, and the silence was unnerving. Our footsteps seemed muffled, swallowed by the dense trees. "You see anything?" David asked, his voice breaking the stillness. "Nothing," Mark replied, but his tone was uneasy. We walked deeper, maybe 50 feet, when all 3 flashlights went out at once. The darkness was instant and absolute. "What the hell?" David muttered. "Let's go back," Mark said, his voice shaking. Then we heard it, a rustling sound, slow and deliberate, coming from the trees ahead. It wasn't an animal. It was too rhythmic, too calculated. Run, David said suddenly, grabbing my arm. Now! We turned and bolted, the branches clawing at our clothes as we stumbled back toward the fence. My heart pounded in my chest and my breath came in short, panicked gasps. As I ran, I realized my hat was missing. I must have dropped it in the chaos. When we reached the house, Clara was waiting on the porch, her face pale. You shouldn't have gone in, she said, her voice trembling. Inside, I froze. My hat was sitting on the kitchen table, perfectly placed as if waiting for me. I stared at it, my mind racing. There's no way, I whispered. How did it get here? David's face was pale. We locked the house before we left, he said. No one else has a key. Mark sat down heavily, his hands shaking. Maybe we're imagining it, right? Clara shook her head. You didn't imagine anything. We sat in silence, the weight of the night pressing down on us. No one spoke about the grove again, and I left the next morning, eager to put the whole experience behind me. Weeks later, I found a package on my doorstep. No name, no return address. Inside was my hat, neatly folded, with a single black feather tucked into the brim. I never contacted David to ask if he sent it. Something in my gut told me it wasn't him. To this day, I still wonder what watches from the grove and why it never truly lets anything go. Story 5. When I was in 6th grade, my school band traveled to a regional competition. The group was split between 2 vehicles, a minivan carrying most of the band and an old truck where I rode with 3 others and our band intern, Mr. Klein. My mom was a chaperone and followed in her own car since I had to leave for my grandparents' house after the competition. The minivan had already arrived at the hotel when we were still on the road. It was late, the sky a deep navy blue, and the air carried the stillness of small towns after dark. The truck and my mom's car drove side by side for most of the trip. I could see her headlights next to us at every turn, a comforting reminder that she was close. At some point, the GPS directed us onto a narrow back road. The pavement was cracked, and the trees were so dense they created a tunnel overhead, their branches leaning inward as if trying to close us in. The further we drove, the darker it felt, and the truck's headlights seemed to barely cut through the thick, shadowy air. Ellie, who sat next to me in the back seat, shifted uneasily. This road feels weird, she said, her voice just above a whisper. It's just an old road, Mr. Klein said, though his tone wasn't entirely convincing. Tom, sitting in the front, turned to look at us. Have you noticed how quiet it's gotten? Ellie and I exchanged a glance. He was right. The usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves were gone. Even the truck's engine seemed muffled, as if the road itself absorbed the sound. I turned to check behind us and saw my mom's car, her headlights steady and bright. She's still back there, I said, pointing. Ellie leaned over to look. Yeah, I see it. We continued down the road until we came to an old wooden bridge. Mr. Klein slowed the truck to a crawl as the planks creaked loudly under the weight of the vehicle. I glanced behind us again. My mom's car was still there, the same make, model, and color. Her headlights illuminated the bridge in a soft glow. She's following pretty close, Ellie said. Maybe the road is freaking her out too, I replied, though the unease in my voice was clear. Once we crossed the bridge, the road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. The trees grew even denser, their branches so low they scraped the roof of the truck. Tom glanced at the GPS. It says we should be close to the hotel, he said, his voice uncertain. As we drove, Ellie kept looking behind us. She's still there, she muttered, almost to herself. Of course she is, I said. She's driving to the same place. Ellie turned to me, her expression uneasy. But what if that's not her? Her words sent a chill down my spine, and for a moment the truck was silent except for the hum of the engine. I didn't answer, but I couldn't help glancing back again. The headlights were still there, unwavering. Finally, after what felt like hours, we emerged from the forest and pulled into the hotel parking lot. The minivan was parked out front, and the band members were gathered in the lobby, laughing and chatting. We climbed out of the truck, relieved to be out of the eerie darkness of the woods. My mom stepped out of the hotel, a jacket draped over her arm. She smiled when she saw me. Took you long enough, she said. I've been here for 10 minutes. I froze. You've been here? She nodded. I got here a while ago. Why? Ellie's face went pale. But you were behind us. My mom frowned, glancing between us. No, I wasn't. I missed a turn and had to take a different route. That road looked too dangerous, so my GPS redirected me. I felt a chill run down my spine. But we saw your car. It followed us the whole way. Mr. Klein stepped forward, trying to laugh it off. You must have seen another car. Same model, same color. Ellie shook her head. It was her car. I know what I saw. My mom's expression darkened. My car's been parked here for 10 minutes. You must be mistaken. No one spoke. The silence pressed down on us, heavy and suffocating. I glanced at Ellie, who stared at the ground, her hands trembling. Later that night, in the hotel room, Ellie knocked on my door. I let her in, and she sat on the bed, clutching her knees. What if it wasn't her, she said quietly. What else could it be? I asked, trying to steady my voice. She didn't answer. Instead, she stared out the window at the dark parking lot below. My mom's car was parked in the same spot, its headlights off, its silhouette unnervingly still. We didn't hear it pass us, Ellie said suddenly. If it wasn't her, where did it go? I didn't know how to respond. The night felt heavier, the air thick with a silence that made my chest tighten. The next morning, we left the hotel, and I tried to shake off the lingering unease. But as we pulled out of the lot, I couldn't help glancing back at the road leading into the woods. For a split second, I thought I saw headlights, dim, distant, and unmoving, watching us from the edge of the trees. To this day, I still don't know what followed us that night. All I know is that it wasn't my mom. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving alone, I catch glimpses of headlights in my rearview mirror. They're always just far enough back to make me wonder if they're really there, or if something else is watching me, waiting. Story, 6-7 years ago, my wife and I bought a small farmhouse on 15 acres of dense forest in northern Wisconsin. The house was old but charming, and the land stretched far, surrounded by trees that seemed to whisper in the wind. At first, it felt like a peaceful escape, but it didn't take long for the woods to reveal their secrets. The first incident happened one summer evening. My wife Laura and I were sitting on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The crickets were loud, and fireflies blinked in the growing darkness. Suddenly, the forest went silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness. Do you hear that? Laura said, her voice low. I nodded. Nothing. That's the problem. Then came the sound, a low, guttural growl followed by a high-pitched screech. It echoed through the trees, sending a shiver down my spine. Laura clutched my arm. That wasn't a coyote, she whispered. I stood up, grabbing the flashlight from the table. I'll check it out. Laura tightened her grip. Don't go out there, please. I hesitated, staring at the tree line. The sound had stopped, but the silence was worse. It felt heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. It's probably just a raccoon or something, I said, though I didn't believe it. The next day, I ventured into the woods with my son, Will. We followed the trail leading to an old barn at the edge of the property. The barn was falling apart, its roof caved in, and vines crept along the weathered wood. As we approached, Will stopped abruptly. Do you see that? He said, pointing to the barn. I squinted. See what? There, in the window. His voice was shaky. I stepped closer, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move behind the broken glass. But when I looked again, it was gone. It's probably a bird, I said, trying to sound confident. Let's check it out. We pushed open the creaking door, the scent of rot and decay hitting us immediately. The interior was dim, sunlight filtering through the cracks in the walls. In the corner, I noticed something odd, a circle of animal bones, arranged meticulously on the dirt floor. What is that? Will whispered. Some kind of prank, maybe, I said, though my gut told me otherwise. Let's head back. That night, as Laura and I sat in the living room, Will burst through the door, his face pale. I saw it again, he said, breathless, in the woods. Laura stood up. What did you see? He shook his head, his eyes wide. It was tall, Dad, taller than you, and it was just watching me. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle. Show me. Will led me to the edge of the woods, pointing toward a cluster of trees. It was right there. I shone the flashlight, but there was nothing. The beam of light danced off the trunks, casting long shadows. There's nothing here, I said, though the unease in my chest said otherwise. The next day, Will refused to go outside. Laura was on edge, constantly glancing toward the forest. That evening, I set up a trail camera near the barn, determined to capture whatever was out there. A week later, I retrieved the camera. There were no animals, no movement, just static images of the barn. But in the last photo, I saw it. A figure, impossibly tall and thin, standing in the distance. Its limbs were elongated and its head tilted unnaturally to the side. I showed the photo to Laura. "What is that?" she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I admitted, "but it's real." The final incident happened last winter. Will and his friend Connor went for a walk in the woods. They came back running, their faces pale. "Something's out there," Connor said. "It was by the barn." "What did you see?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "It was huge," Will said. 10 feet tall, maybe more. Its arms were too long, and its skin was dark like it absorbed the light. Laura stood up. "This has to stop. You need to go out there and figure out what's happening." I grabbed my rifle and headed to the barn, the snow crunching under my boots. The forest was silent, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. As I approached the barn, I saw footprints in the snow, large clawed prints that led to the doorway and stopped abruptly. I stepped inside, the cold seeping through my jacket. The circle of bones was gone, replaced by a single deer skull placed on the ground. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. The barn was dark, the air thick with the scent of decay. Then I heard it, a whisper, faint but clear. "Leave!" I bolted, running back to the house. That night, as we locked every door and window, Laura turned to me. "We need to leave. This place isn't safe." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that leaving wouldn't make a difference. Whatever was in those woods, it wasn't bound by fences or walls. It was watching, waiting. Even now, months later, I can't forget the feeling of those eyes on me. I don't go into the woods anymore, but sometimes late at night I hear it, the low growl, the faint whisper. And I wonder if it's only a matter of time before it comes out of the trees. Story 7. When my sister and I were 12 and 10, our grandfather gave us a tent. He'd saved up enough Marlboro UPCs to redeem for it, a massive, rugged thing with Marlboro stamped boldly on the side. My mom hated it. She said it was a cheap excuse for a gift. But to us, it was the coolest thing in the world. We set it up at the edge of the woods behind our house, right near the property line. It was late summer, and the air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. We were determined to spend our first night in the tent, armed with flashlights, sleeping bags, and a stash of candy. The first few hours were full of giggles and ghost stories. But then something changed. The first sound was faint, like a soft scraping against the tent fabric. My sister froze mid-laugh. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, holding my breath. A second later, we saw it. An indentation dragging itself across the tent wall, slow and deliberate, as if a massive hand, or something worse, was pressing against the fabric. The scraping sound followed, low and guttural, like nails against canvas. "What is that?" she hissed, clutching my arm. I swallowed hard, trying to play it cool. "Probably Dad messing with us," I said, though my stomach churned with doubt. I grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent. The night outside was eerily quiet. The beam of my flashlight swept over the trees and the tall grass. There was nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone or anything. Just the oppressive darkness pressing in from all sides. "Nobody's there," I said, my voice hollow. "I want to go inside," my sister whimpered. We packed up and bolted back to the house. The next morning, I returned to the tent to check for tears or marks, but found nothing unusual. A week later, the tent was gone. Mom said she'd thrown it away because it was an eyesore, but her tone was strange, almost defensive. Years passed, and the woods remained a place of both fascination and unease. I would explore them often, but the deeper I went, the heavier the air seemed to get. It wasn't just the thick undergrowth or the shadowy canopy. It was something else, something that watched. One crisp autumn morning, I woke before dawn to a sound that made my blood run cold. A scream tore through the trees, so loud it seemed to vibrate through the walls of the house. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely animal either. It had an unnatural metallic edge to it, like a fox's cry layered with static. I shook my dad awake. "Did you hear that?" He rubbed his eyes, his face pale. "Stay inside," he said firmly, grabbing his shotgun. He never explained what he saw or didn't see that morning, but the look on his face when he returned told me enough. Months later, during one of Dad's late-night Bible readings, an odd habit of his when he couldn't sleep, the scream came again. This time, it was closer. So close it sounded like it was coming from just outside the kitchen window. Everyone in the house woke up, and we spent the next hour searching the yard, the garage, even the wood's edge. But we found nothing. Just the unsettling silence that always followed the noise. By the time I reached high school, the incidents had started to fade from memory. Then I got a cat, a scrappy little thing named Whiskers. She was mostly an outdoor cat, but we always brought her into the garage at night to keep her safe from coyotes. One evening, she didn't come back. I told myself she'd wandered too far and would show up in a day or two. Cats did that sometimes, but she didn't. A week passed before I decided to search the woods. I didn't want to, but something compelled me to go. I ventured into the dense trees, calling her name, my voice echoing through the stillness. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a pile of leaves, but as I got closer, I realized it was her, or what was left of her. Her small body was wrong, twisted. The fur was gone, the flesh turned inside out like someone or something had flipped her. I stumbled backward, bile rising in my throat. I ran home choking on tears. When I told my parents what I'd found, they exchanged a look. Not one of disbelief, but of recognition. That night I confronted Dad. "What's out there?" He sighed heavily, his eyes fixed on the darkened window. "There are things in these woods we don't understand," he said finally. "Things that don't belong here." I never went back into the woods after that, but sometimes late at night I hear it again. That scream slicing through the quiet. It feels closer each time, as if whatever's out there is moving toward the house, and I can't shake the feeling that one day it won't stop at the edge of the trees. Story 8. When my older brother Jacob was 12, he and his best friend Dylan loved exploring the woods near our grandparents' property. The woods were dense, sprawling, and steeped in whispered legends that the locals liked to pass around. Most stories were dismissed as campfire tales, but Jacob always felt there was something off about those trees. One summer evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jacob and Dylan wandered deeper into the woods than ever before. They were laughing and shining their flashlights through the undergrowth when gravel stones began raining down from the trees. "Who's there?" Jacob shouted, though his voice cracked. Dylan clutched his arm. "Don't yell. What if it's—" Before he could finish, a larger stone struck a tree near them. The sound echoed like a warning. Fueled by a mix of bravado and fear, they bolted toward the tree line, their flashlights darting through the shadows. But when they reached the spot where they thought someone had been hiding, there was nothing. Just silence and the overwhelming scent of wet earth. That was the last time Jacob ever ventured into the woods after dark. Years later, Jacob had another encounter, one that cemented his refusal to ever set foot near those trees again. He was driving his friend Brian to our grandparents' house late one rainy night when something caught his eye. Across the road, illuminated by his headlights, was an old woman shuffling slowly, clutching something tightly to her chest. "She needs help," Brian said, leaning forward. Jacob pulled the car to a stop and rolled down the window. "Ma'am, do you need a ride?" As soon as he spoke, the woman froze. Then, without warning, she let out a blood-curdling scream and sprinted toward the car, her arms still wrapped protectively around whatever she was holding. Her face, contorted in rage, was only inches away when Jacob slammed the car into reverse, tires screeching as he sped away. Brian was pale. "What the hell was that? She wasn't holding a shawl. Did you see it?" Jacob didn't respond, his hands gripping the wheel. He didn't stop driving until they reached the safety of our grandparents' driveway. The woman was a figure of local legend. They called her the Mother of the Woods. The story went that she had once lost her son deep in the forest. His body was found days later near a stream, his tiny fingers clutched around a doll. Heartbroken, she had wandered into the woods one night and never returned. Locals claimed to see her wandering the forest, clutching a bundle to her chest, screaming at anyone who dared enter after dark. Not everyone believed the stories, but there were enough strange accounts to give them weight. In 2016, a graduate student named Matthew, studying waterfowl in the area, had an experience he couldn't explain. He had been tracking a flock of ducks when his phone suddenly died, even though it had been fully charged. As he stood there frustrated, a figure emerged from the trees. It was a woman moving slowly, her arms cradling something. Matthew ducked behind a tree, his breath shallow. She walked past him, her bare feet silent on the forest floor. Compelled by a mix of fear and curiosity, Matthew decided to follow her. The woods grew darker, the air heavier. Eventually, she led him to a clearing where 3 small, dilapidated sheds stood in a circle. The woman stopped in the center, her back to him. Then, as if sensing his presence, she turned. Her face was a grotesque mask of stretched skin and hollow eyes, and she smiled, baring impossibly sharp teeth. Matthew froze, paralyzed by fear. The woman didn't move, but the bundle in her arms shifted. Something inside it moved. That was enough for Matthew. He turned and ran, his legs burning as he sprinted through the forest. When he finally burst onto the main road, his phone turned back on, displaying 85% battery. Over the years, more stories trickled in. A farmer heard shrieking from the woods late at night, like the sound of an animal in pain or a child crying. A hunter swore he saw a circle of rabbits sitting eerily still near the edge of the forest. My girlfriend once saw the same thing while driving by at dusk. A perfect circle of motionless rabbits, their eyes reflecting the car's headlights like glass beads. One night, I decided to see the woods for myself. Jacob warned me against it, but curiosity got the better of me. Armed with a flashlight and a canteen, I ventured in, following the old trails Jacob had once walked. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence. And then I saw her. She stood at the edge of a clearing, her back to me, her gray hair matted with dirt. In her arms was the bundle, swaying gently as if alive. My mouth went dry as I took a step back, snapping a twig underfoot. She turned slowly. Her face was obscured by shadows, but her hollow eyes locked onto mine. Her lips moved, forming silent words, and for a brief moment, I thought I heard a child's cry. I ran. Branches clawed at my arms and legs, but I didn't stop until I was back on the road, gasping for breath. When I turned back, the woods were dark and still, but I knew she was watching. To this day, I can't explain what I saw. Jacob doesn't ask, and I don't tell him. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint sound of a child crying from the direction of the forest. And I wonder if the woman is still there, clutching her bundle, waiting for someone to find her, or whatever it is she's holding. Story 9. When I was 12, my family moved to a quiet town on the edge of a dense forest. The house was modern, sitting on a large lot that bordered the woods. The forest had a reputation in the area. The neighbors spoke of its beauty, its long trails, and, in hushed tones, its strange history. My parents dismissed the stories as small-town folklore, and I didn't think much of it either. I was more focused on exploring the new place with my brothers. The first few days were spent unpacking and settling in. Then one sunny afternoon, my dad decided to take us on a walk through the forest trail that started right at the edge of our backyard. He wanted to encourage our sense of adventure. We set off, excited and carefree, weaving through the towering trees and marveling at the stillness of the woods. Everything was normal, at first. As we neared the end of the trail, where it looped back toward our property, I noticed something odd. The path split ahead into 2 directions, forming a Y shape. My dad confidently led us to the left, but something about the right path caught my attention. It was narrower, barely visible through the dense undergrowth, as if it hadn't been used in years. Without thinking, I slowed my steps and let the others move ahead, while I veered onto the right-hand path, curiosity getting the better of me. The air felt different here. It was colder, and the silence seemed heavier, pressing against my ears. I walked for what felt like only a few minutes before the trees abruptly gave way to an open field. But it wasn't just any field. It was covered in wildflowers, an endless sea of yellow, white, and orange blooms swaying gently in a breeze I couldn't feel. The sight was mesmerizing, but it felt wrong. The trees at the edges of the field loomed like silent sentinels, their branches forming unnatural shapes against the sky. "Hey!" my dad's voice called from behind me, snapping me out of my trance. He sounded far away, even though I knew he couldn't have been more than a few hundred feet. "Where are you?" "Over here," I shouted back, turning to retrace my steps. But as I did, the path I had just walked seemed to vanish. The undergrowth had closed in, and the trees were now unfamiliar, their dark trunks twisting in ways that made my stomach churn. I was sure I had come from that direction, but now it all looked wrong. I panicked and began to run, pushing through branches and thorns, desperate to find my way back. My dad's voice grew louder, and finally I stumbled onto the main trail where he and my brother stood waiting. their faces a mix of concern and irritation. "What were you thinking?" my dad asked, his tone stern. I hesitated, glancing over my shoulder. The narrow path I had taken was gone, replaced by dense trees. "There was another trail," I stammered, "in a field. It was full of flowers." My dad frowned. "There's no field here," he said. "The woods back up to more trees in a ravine. You must have imagined it." But I knew what I had seen. I kept quiet and followed them back to the house, though the image of the field lingered in my mind. A year later, during another summer, my brothers and I decided to explore the woods again. We had heard nothing unusual about the forest since moving in, and I had almost convinced myself that my experience had been a dream. Almost. As we walked the trail, joking and laughing, I felt a familiar pull when we reached the spot where the path had split before. This time, it was my younger brother who noticed it first. "Hey, look, did you see that trail over there?" he asked, pointing toward the right. My stomach dropped. The path was back, just as I remembered it. "We should go that way," he said, already veering off the main trail. "No," I said quickly, grabbing his arm. "It doesn't lead anywhere." He frowned at me. "How do you know?" I hesitated, unsure of how to explain. "I just do. Let's stick to the main path." But he ignored me and ran ahead. My older brother rolled his eyes and followed, and I had no choice but to trail after them. The air grew colder as we walked, just as it had before, and soon enough, the forest opened up to reveal the field. Only this time, it wasn't full of wildflowers. It was barren, a wasteland of cracked earth and skeletal tree stumps. The air smelled faintly of sulfur, and the silence was suffocating. "What is this place?" my younger brother whispered, his voice barely audible. None of us had an answer. We stood there frozen until a rustling sound broke the stillness. It came from the far end of the field, where the trees formed a dark wall. Something was moving, but it wasn't an animal. It was tall, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs that seemed to bend in ways they shouldn't. Its movements were slow and deliberate, as if it were studying us. "We need to go," I said, my voice shaking. My brothers nodded, their faces pale, and we turned to leave. But the path behind us was gone again, replaced by the same dense trees and undergrowth that had trapped me before. Panic set in as we searched for a way out, the rustling growing louder with each passing second. Finally, we broke through the undergrowth and onto the main trail, gasping for breath. When we reached the house, my dad was waiting on the porch, his expression concerned. "What happened?" he asked. I glanced back at the woods, half expecting to see that thing watching us from the tree line. But there was nothing there. That night, I dreamt of the field. The flowers had returned, but they were wilting, their petals blackened and curling. In the center of the field stood the figure, its head tilting as if to beckon me closer. When I woke, I could still smell the sulfur. We never went back to that part of the woods again, but sometimes on quiet nights, I swear I can hear rustling in the trees, like something is waiting for us to return. Story 10. It happened just last week in southern New Jersey. My house sits on the edge of a dense forest, with a large sliding glass door at the back, leading to a wooden deck. Beyond that, there's a sloping hill that disappears into the pine barrens. If you've ever heard of the Jersey Devil, you know exactly why locals like to joke about my backyard being prime devil country. It was a quiet Thursday night. I was on the couch with my friends Alex and Eric, half watching TV and half talking about the upcoming weekend. The room was dim, lit only by the flickering blue light of the screen. Alex sat closest to the sliding glass door, his back to it. "You know, this show is boring," Eric said, flipping through the channels. "Why do we even watch this junk?" Alex didn't respond. His head tilted slightly and he squinted at the glass door behind him. "What's your problem?" Eric asked, finally noticing Alex's distraction. Alex kept staring at the glass. "I thought I saw something." "Out there," he said slowly. I glanced over. The forest beyond the deck was pitch black, nothing but shadows and trees. "Probably just a raccoon," I said, trying to downplay it. "They love scrounging around at night." Alex didn't look convinced. "It wasn't small like a raccoon," he said. "It was taller, like a person." Eric rolled his eyes. "You've been watching too many of those ghost hunter shows. It's nothing." Just then, Alex froze, his eyes locked on the glass door. "There! Do you see that?" he whispered urgently. I turned my head just in time to catch it, a pale, round shape ducking behind one of the trees near the edge of the deck. My stomach tightened. Did you see it? Alex asked, his voice low but firm. Yeah, I muttered. Something's out there. Eric sighed, grabbing the flashlight from the counter. All right, I'm going out there to prove it's nothing. Probably some teenager messing around. Eric, don't, Alex said, his tone sharp. It didn't look like a person. Eric ignored him and slid the glass door open. The cold night air rushed in, sending a chill through the room. He stepped onto the deck, shining the flashlight toward the tree line. All right, he shouted into the dark. Whoever's out there, you're not funny. Get out of here. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then from behind one of the trees, a figure leaned out, pale, smooth-faced, and utterly still. It stayed there just watching us. Holy crap, Alex whispered. It's not moving. Eric, I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. Get back inside. Eric took a step forward instead, his flashlight beam trembling. Who are you? He yelled. What do you want? The figure darted behind another tree, faster than any person should be able to move. Then, to my horror, 2 more heads appeared from the shadows, one on either side of the first tree. All 3 figures tilted their heads in unison, like they were studying us. Eric, now, I said more forcefully. Eric stepped back, still holding the flashlight. This isn't right. He backed toward the door, but before he could step inside, the sound started. A low, guttural growl echoed from the woods, followed by a high-pitched screech that made my ears ring. What the hell is that? Alex said, his voice shaking. Eric bolted inside, slamming the glass door shut behind him. We locked it and stood there staring at the dark forest. The screeching stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. They're still out there, Alex said, pointing. The motion light on the deck had flicked on, illuminating the figures. They were closer now, standing just beyond the deck railing. Their faces were featureless, their bodies unnaturally thin. One of them raised a hand, long and bony, and pointed toward the door. They're not people, Alex whispered. They can't be people. Eric grabbed a knife from the counter. We need to scare them off, he said, his voice steady but low. If they try to get in, they're not coming in, I interrupted. They're not trying to. They're just watching. The 3 of us stood there, frozen, as the figures remained motionless. Then, without warning, they turned in unison and walked back toward the trees. Their movements were smooth, almost gliding. Within seconds, they disappeared into the darkness. We didn't move for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Eric broke the silence. What the hell was that? Alex shook his head, his face pale. I don't know, but I don't think we should stay here. We slept in the living room that night, all 3 of us too scared to go upstairs. In the morning, we checked the deck in the yard. There were no footprints, no signs of anyone or anything having been there. The forest was silent, as if it were holding its breath. Later that day, I went to the edge of the woods alone. I don't know why. I guess I needed to prove to myself that it was real. As I stood there staring into the trees, I thought I saw movement again, deeper in the shadows. A soft, raspy voice drifted out from the woods, barely audible. We'll see you soon. I turned and walked back to the house, my heart pounding. I haven't been outside after dark since.